Het the board baron, Bjornes gangen that he on them east west the Ellen stode. Ne might therefore water wereld to them Othram. There come flowed after Eben, looking like a streamus. To lang hit him thuta Huena, he together Gara's baron. Welcome to day 4, ladies and gentlemen, and don't worry, we're not going to be studying that. That is the Battle of Maldon out of the Anglo-Saxon era of literature. Today's lesson is going to be on literary eras. Literary eras are time periods that we use to study English. We divide it up into periods so that we can break it up and study it better. Literary eras are to some extent, they're kind of arbitrary divisions of time, especially if you're an existentialist. You would wonder who had the authority to determine when one era begins and one ends. But it does help to break literature up, or anything up. I mean, we do it with science, we do it with math, we do it with history, we do it with literature too. 1,000 years ago, this is what literature would have looked like, except it wouldn't have been typed like this. But this is what the language of the Anglo-Saxons looked like. It was barely even English. It was more German than anything else. English is a Germanic language. It's in the Germanic family of languages, and it's related to German and other languages that are derived from sort of like the older version of German. And so it makes sense to divide up the Anglo-Saxons and turn them into their own literary era because they spoke a different language. Chaucer and the Middle Ages, that's the second of the literary eras. And the Middle Ages, the language was still not really English. If you thought that Shakespeare was hard to understand, you should have a look at Chaucer, and I've linked to it on today's lesson. I'd like you to take 5 minutes and just have a read, just to see what it was like. I've got a nice side-by-side text so that you can see what did it sound like in Chaucer's time, what did it look like, and just kind of, just play around with it a little bit just to get a sense. The periods of time, the eras that we're going to be looking at though, are the 4 main ones: Renaissance, Romantics, Victorians, and Moderns. Now, a lot of people would say that there's also the postmodern era, and that's the era that we're in. I think that it's a little bit premature for us to start deciding what era we're in. I think history does that for us. I mean, that's how we decided that, the 1700s, like late 1700s and early 1800s were the Romantic era, was because we looked back at it from afterwards and decided that, you know what, this time period, the writers had similar themes in their work and they wrote a similar style, so we'll call it a literary era. But we get into the Renaissance era, and then things get a little bit more, you'll recognize them because of course you've had Shakespeare every year, and after Shakespeare we get into the Romantics. Now there's kind of a time period missing in there called the Restoration, but we're going to skip over that one just because of time, I think, and also because the poetry is much better in the Renaissance and in the Romantic eras, I think. So it's my own personal bias. So we go from Renaissance to Romantics, and the word romantic does not mean it's going to be about like snuggling up beside a fireplace or something like that, or a long walk on a beach. The technical usage of romantic and what it means is it means idealized. So a romance novel kind of like idealizes life in a way, like you've got, this sort of like perfect romance that happens. The Romantic era is about just idealizing everything. So for example, a story about, or a poem about daffodils. Daffodil is the great flower, but I don't know that I would think that you'd have to devote a whole poem to it, but a romantic author would. Wordsworth did. So you take something that's kind of simple and you idealize it, you build it up, you sort of like just see the greatness in it, I guess you would say. Characters in the Romantic era tend to be black and white. They're either really great or really terrible, like good and evil, that sort of thing. So that's what Romanticism really means. After that, we have the Victorian era. Good thing that Queen Victoria lived a long time, because then it just sort of like happened to be a good way to label that era. But the Victorian era, it has nothing to do with Queen Victoria herself. It has to do with the style of the time. It's kind of a neat, it's almost like a throwback to the Renaissance times. So a lot of the Victorian writers, and of course you've already studied one, you studied Tennyson. He's the most well-known. I wouldn't say he's the best poet, but at the time they thought he was the best poet. He was poet laureate. You've already seen Tennyson and you've seen his style. You'll see that the style of other Victorian writers tends to be similar to Renaissance writers in a lot of ways. They go back to that really rigid style and structure of poetry. And you're going to see a lot of iambic pentameter, I believe, when you look at Victorian era poetry, which is definitely something that went out in the Romantic era. They went from that iambic pentameter style to more of a tetrameter style, and lyrical ballads, which are those sort of musical poems that tell a story. They tend to be written in quatrains and sometimes alternating between like tetrameter and triameter. So 8 feet on one line and then 6 on the next, and then 8 feet and then 6 feet. And it creates a nice musical effect. They kind of get back to the Renaissance though with Victorian lit. Then we move into the modern era and things take a huge change. It's weird. You'd almost think that something drastic happened when you start looking at modern poetry, because it looks nothing like any poetry that came before it. Well, something drastic did happen. Life happened. Basically, we get influenced, like the English tradition gets influenced by the French and the German traditions, who they're emphasizing more the beauty of ideas than the beauty of words and craft. So that's where you get free verse poetry from. It's the idea that the beauty in the poem, it doesn't have to do with the way you say something, but it's what you say. I want you to think about it for a minute. For anybody who is a poet out there, I know in some of you with your little bios that you wrote, you are writers, and so I want you to think, for anybody who's ever had to write poetry for some kind of assignment, have you been in that position where you couldn't find that rhyming word? Of course you have. You needed a word that rhymed with orange, for example. And you couldn't find one. And so you have to start tinkering with your wording in order to make it rhyme. And what you do is you end up narrowing down the number of thoughts that you could actually express, right? That's what lyrical poetry, that's like the fault of it. It sounds amazing when it's executed well. Like Marianne is a great example of a poem. As depressing as it is, it sounds great. I didn't put it on because it's massive, but one of my favorite poems is called The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. It was by a romantic poet named Coleridge. It's huge, but it's very musical, and it's a great poem. But you narrow down what you can say. Free verse poetry in the modern era, it opens up the world. So you have an unlimited number of thoughts that you can express. It doesn't sound musical. A truly great poet is still going to make their poetry sound good though. So you don't have to make it rhyme to make it sound good, or even you don't have to have a rhyme scheme. You can still tuck in some rhyme from time to time. You could add some consonants and some assonance and alliteration. There are a variety of techniques that you can do to make the poetry sound good. Just good diction and word choice can do it too. But the emphasis in the modern era, and if you believe we're in the postmodern era, then the postmodern era, it has to do with the ideas themselves, not the words that they're expressed with. So that is your overview of literary eras. You've got the Anglo-Saxons, and then the medieval era, and then we get into Renaissance, Romantics, Victorians, moderns. So today's lesson, broken up into 3 parts, is going to involve, the first part is going to be you learning about the 4 eras and the characteristics of those eras and just getting some background knowledge. One of the expectations of this course is you should be able to listen to a lecture and take notes. It's a great skill to have, very important skill to have going forward into university. For most of you, your courses next year are going to be you sitting with 399 other people in something that resembles a movie theater, except instead of a screen up at the front, there's a professor standing there and they start talking and they don't quit for like 2 hours, all right? And you sit there and you take notes. So you need to be able to listen and to discern what's important, what's not important, to jot down the important things, and also to be able to make sense of things as you listen, because notes that you don't understand are absolutely worthless. So I'm not going to be demanding that you use a certain type of note taking. I think by grade 12 you hopefully have got some sort of technique that works for you. If you don't, then this is a good opportunity to try something new. If you found that note taking, you end up with like a bunch of useless notes. I always say that, I didn't make this up, but if you always do what you've always done, then you'll always get what you've always gotten. So if you've always ended up with useless notes at the end of a course that weren't much help for studying, something's broken and you should do something to fix it. So there's going to be 4 lectures that you're going to listen to, and they're not boring. I've tried to find good ones. You'll listen to them, you'll take notes, and this should be 1 class period's worth of time. I think that it's important for you to learn that with this e-learning course that you have to budget your time and you have to set aside like a certain amount of time for a certain lesson. So if you're supposed to be working 5 hours per day, do the math on that. If I had broken up my lesson into 3 parts, you divide 5 by 3 and you can figure out how many minutes you should be spending on any given task at a maximum. So that's the first part, is going to be just learning about the literary eras. Then the second and third parts are going to involve you reading poetry from those eras and responding. We're going to get away from the analysis and the interpretation, and we're going to get into just connection making, because the thing is, poetry, if you let it be awesome, it is awesome. It really is amazing to see like the skill that a writer, that a human being can have when it comes to using words. And I hate ruining that. When it comes to school as a teacher, I have to assign things like analysis activities to verify that you're actually doing the work. But deep down, what I'd really like to do is just read some poetry. So today, the balance is, on the one side, I am assigning a fair amount of poetry for you to read, but on the other side, the writing tasks that go along with them are going to be less about analyzing and digging deep into the text and applying terminology, and more about just making connections. Like connections, there's 3 types. There's connections between texts, between the text and yourself, and between the text and the world. So basically it involves reading a poem, thinking about it, and responding to it, and hopefully, in all of that, enjoying it. Hope you enjoyed Heart of Darkness today. It's actually still day 3 right now. I filmed these the day before. Hope you enjoyed that, and hopefully that went well. If you need any assistance with your reading, whether it be for Heart of Darkness or for the independent novellas that you're going to be reading, drop me a line, send me an email. I get lonely sometimes sitting in the afternoon with my phone wondering if students are going to ask me questions and stuff. So take advantage of the situation and send me an email, ask me a question if necessary. All right? So good luck today. Today is the last lesson of the unit. That went by really fast. Tomorrow is going to be project day. And for those of you who worked really hard and put a lot of effort in your work so far, I think you're going to enjoy the project I've designed for you. See you tomorrow.